This story starts with children playing in an attic. The attic was that of David Livingstone, and they had plenty to interest them there. Assegais and skins of various sorts and so on. And they thoroughly enjoyed their time with these different artifacts that David Livingstone had brought back from his long journeys. The story continues now with a vast number of Christians in Central Africa, parts of the areas that were explored by David Livingstone, but other parts were by my own forebearers. And today there is in Central Africa, the part of Central Africa where I grew up, a vibrant church with hospitals, schools, orphanages, and so on, all as a result of the gospel being preached to the people of Central Africa. I myself grew up among the Lunda. They were a tribe which was anything but warlike. They were often taken as slaves and sold and suffered terribly at the hands of Arab slave traders from the east and of other slave traders from the west. So those are the sort of parameters, and as I say, still today a tremendous amount is happening as a result of the work of those early pioneers. I myself am related, I'm not directly related to David Livingstone, but I am related to one of the children who used to play in his attic. And I will simply call the person, the relation, Fred. He was also called Monali and other names as that, but Fred will do. And he is one of my forebearers. My father fought in the Second World War, in the First World War. Fortunately for him, he was very mechanically minded, and so he wasn't in the trenches. He was helping to sort out the trucks and lorries and so on that were needed there. And when the war ended, he felt that God was calling him to work in Central Africa. At first he went to one of the mines in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and worked on the mine, but he knew that that wasn't where God wanted him to be permanently. And so eventually he went further inland, and he met a person who had started to evangelize a cannibal tribe. So the first Africans that my father tried to evangelize were in fact cannibals. Officially, cannibalism had been put down by the Belgians, because at that time that had become part of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the Belgians decided that they were going to try and use these erstwhile cannibals to help them to police the that part of the Congo. And they didn't realize that if you don't change the heart, you don't get anything permanent done. So they gave them uniforms and guns and called them policemen. Well, it wasn't very long before they turned on their officers, and many of their officers ended up as soup, and the cannibals were unrepentant about that. Fortunately, cannibals didn't eat missionaries. Possibly they were too tough. So that was the first group of people that my father got involved with evangelizing. The person Dad joined as a missionary couldn't have been more dissimilar to my dad. My dad was tall, 6 foot one, had been an officer in the war, military bearing, physically very strong. The person he joined was a short little man, had not had a good education, but had an absolutely brilliant mind. The man was called Dan Crawford. He could, within 6 months of going into a region where there were people who were total strangers to him, he had got enough of the language to be able to converse freely. And short time later, he was in fact able to take that language of the Luban people and commit it to writing and translated the Bible into Lubasanga. A brilliant man with a brilliant mind, although, as I say, he actually didn't have a very good education. Dan Crawford was also a brilliant writer. I have been able to get hold of a large number of books written by missionaries, and usually they're not very well written. The missionaries, in the evenings, of course, there were no street lights, no lamp. The only lamplight they had were candles and possibly a smoky lantern. So they would write letters to the missionary societies that sent them out, or very often to their mothers. And these would then get into different journals that were put out by the missionary societies in order to keep the people back in England informed about what was happening in Africa. Now this material is readily available, and what I have done is to get hold of that material and simply to cherry pick for a particular audience. I am concerned that some of my own grandchildren have not come to faith, and I want to make sure, or that some of their friends haven't, they all have actually come to faith, but I want to make sure that my grandchildren, my children and grandchildren, know something about the enormous contribution that their forebearers made to Christian endeavor in Central Africa. An endeavour which continues and prospers to this day. On one occasion, Fred had been asked to lead a service in a small church. But that night there was a terrible storm. The rain just battered down, and there was lightning and thunder. However, he made his way to the church, and somebody else had in fact started the service. And in the statement that this person made, he said, God has said here that anybody who leaves home, loved ones, family for his sake and the gospel will be given all sorts of things by God to take their place, and will be made a real blessing to others, just as the disciples of old had found when they gave up everything to follow Christ. In this service, something remarkable happened. As I say, he got there late because of the torrential rain. But as he then got up to preach, suddenly there was a bolt of lightning which seemed to hit him. It was as if he was a light, and they thought that he would be killed, had been killed on the spot. But in fact, nothing happened to him. He was, although there was this terrible crash of lightning, although he suddenly lit up, he stood there and he was completely unharmed and was able to finish the sermon that he had prepared. And he just felt then that, so sure that God had called him and would really look after him. From there they travelled on to Pietermaritzburg, and there they joined 4 trekkers who were making their way into the interior. These were South African Boers, men who were taking goods into the interior, and they were using ox wagons and oxen to do this. And so he joined one of these parties going into the interior. He walked. He had made sure that he had plenty of good waterproof clothing and warm clothing, because they climbed and climbed and climbed to almost 6,000 feet, and it would be very, very cold at night. And he would just sleep under the end of one of these ox wagons and stretched out a tarpaulin to make himself a bit of a tent. And eventually he reached the top of the Drakensberg Mountains, which are a very formidable part of the geography of South Africa.
Okay.
I want now to fast forward to an amazing incident which very, very nearly cost Fred his life. he wanted to go and preach to people on the north bank of the Zambezi River. He felt that that was where he wanted to do missionary work. And to get there, he had to cross the Kalahari Desert. And he was staying at a mission station and being very well looked after and thoroughly enjoying his time there, when the chief of the tribe, who he had got to know and liked very much, told him that he was sending a hunting party to go and hunt elephants on the across the other side of the Kalahari Desert. It was late in the season, and it was going to be a risky trip, but this was an opportunity Fred felt he could not miss. And so he set off with this hunter called Tinker as a mate, and they set off in an ox wagon to cross the Kalahari. They got to the first waterhole, and to their dismay found that they just couldn't use the water. A hyena had died and fallen into the water, and they just couldn't touch it. So they then went on to the next waterhole, and when they got there, they found there was no water. By now, they were getting terribly thirsty. And then they made for a third waterhole, but they just were not going to be able to make it. And in fact, they almost reached the waterhole and then collapsed. And Tinker, the hunter, who was not a Christian at all, he turned to Fred and said to him, "Fred, if ever we needed your God, we need him now." And those were the last words he said, and they all collapsed. Fred even found it difficult to pray. He was in such distress. How could God have brought him to this situation where he hadn't even been able to preach to people and to bring people to Christ? Why had God brought him all this way into Central Africa for him to die of thirst in this way? And with those thoughts, he passed out and just lay prostrate. A troop of bushmen had seen what had taken place. At first they thought they were animals, and then they realized they were people. And they watched, and they saw them all collapse. And then the head of the Bushman clan moved in, and there was a pit, but no water in this pit at all. And he went down to the pit, and together they started to excavate it and to pull sand out. And then he got a reed, a hollow reed, and pushed something into it to prevent it from getting clogged with sand, and then pushed this reed down, down, down into the bottom of this pit, and then sucked nothing, and then sucked again, and eventually smile wreathed his face. He had water in his mouth. He had a tortoise shell, so what he began doing was to suck up the water, pretty foul stuff it was, and then spit it into the tortoise shell, and then that was taken up, and the prostrate, the bodies of the people who were lying on the ground, water was fed into their mouths. And he went on doing this. He started with Fred, and when they got the water into their mouths, they then lost consciousness, but it was a different kind of loss of consciousness. They were no longer thirsty, but they were sleeping. And gradually he put water into the mouths of one after another until they were all fast asleep. And then he spotted a giraffe in the distance, and he set off. They lay for quite some time, and then they began to wake up. And then they all started to talk, because they were still alive. And although they were pretty thirsty, it wasn't the raging thirst that they'd had before. And they were able to make their way to the next waterhole. Their lives had been spared.